Shaver. Please join us.
Hey, how's it going, everybody?
Welcome to WowWest's Hackin Fest Cloud Penetration Roundup.
Absolutely. Well, I want to thank everybody, all the sponsors, and everybody who's out here today. Basically, the talk that I'm going to do today is, how do you take the first steps in an AWS pen test? Like, what are some quick, easy wins that you can potentially do if you're doing that kind of pen test? So that's what our talk is about.
Yeah, no, that sounds amazing. That's, obviously, like being a pen tester, getting keys, it's one of those things where you just want to jump right in and just start, scanning all the things and, trying to get, whatever level of access you have. But definitely am excited to hear your approach.
Yeah, well, and I think that this whole talk really came out of, like, I was a network pen tester and, like, really needed to get up to speed on AWS really quickly. And I just, sort of had to figure it out. And so I wanted to make sure that there were good resources. And there's been some development since then, obviously, but, that there's good resources out there for people who are trying to figure this stuff out. Because there's, so much to cloud that is, complicated and different than the traditional pen tests. So.
Oh, absolutely. And I think, like what you just said, it kind of comes out of necessity. A lot of times, like pretty much everything we do from a pen testing perspective comes out of necessity. We'll hit a wall and then, have to figure out new ways to do things. And that's actually how my class ended up becoming a thing, is because I needed to develop a methodology for attacking organizations that use cloud resources. So I wrote a class.
Yeah, well, and it's so funny because, like, I think a lot of people think that, like, when you are a speaker at conferences or, you do this type of thing, it's like, because you have all of this overflowing knowledge. And it's like, well, no, I wanted to learn this stuff is the reason I speak at stuff. So, it's a really good learning opportunity as well for yourself, so. Teaching
something forces you to learn it at another level, right? Like,
yeah, you need to know it well enough to teach it. So
exactly, yeah. It's not just, hey, I know how to run this command and make stuff happen, make magic happen.
Yeah, exactly. Let's do it. So this is API Keys. Now what? Taking the AWS pen test into the cloud. The overview of this talk is we're going to talk about what is AWS very, very briefly and sort of what we're going to be talking about today. We're going to talk about what API keys are and how to find them. We're going to talk about some tools to help you. Originally, I think people get off the ground with, like, the AWS CLI and programming libraries like Redboto 3. A lot of tools that you use are written in an Amazon AWS SDK like Redboto 3 or the Go one or the .NET one or whatever. I'm going to show you some of the tools that I have written in Redboto 3 and show you how to use them in some examples. And then at the end, we'll talk about some other tools and resources. And, feel free to, ping me with questions in the Discord. I think we'll take a look at them at the end, just so I'm not popping back and forth. But basically, when people think of AWS, I think they primarily think of two things. They think of either EC2 or S3. Even if they don't know the names of them, they're like, oh yeah, AWS, that thing that lets me, like, store stuff and virtualize stuff. Okay, that's what AWS is to a lot of people. That's it's a good chunk of AWS, but there's lots of parts to AWS. And EC2 is an amazing virtualization and automation way to automate virtualization. And you use S3 all day browsing to websites, and it's an integral part of the web and the internet at this point. So, and I don't love AD as an analogy for AWS, but I think a lot of people are just familiar with Windows. So I like to use it as an analogy. If you're hearing all these terms in AWS land, and you're like, what are all these things, right? So you're all familiar with, like, hopefully Active Directory, and all of these other technologies, right? And they accomplish a task. And in AWS land, there's similar, not always the exact, feature complete comparison, but, there's all of these different services that you could do stuff with. Okay. And there are more and more every week. It seems like there's even services for your services. So, like, there's a service that lets you query S3 as if it were a database. So that's a service of a service. And so there's all kinds of things that AWS can do, not just virtual machines and storage. Okay. For the most part, we're going to be sticking to EC2 and S3 today. That's your virtual machines and your storage. That's where most of the good stuff is. There's some cool stuff in other places, but for now, we're going to stick with those. We're also going to talk about some of the surrounding technologies like identity and access management and networking, which are also, ancillary technologies. So I'm going to be talking about the AWS console several times today. Keep in mind that when I say the word console, it's actually the web GUI. The console is different than like the command line interface for AWS. But one thing that you really want to think about when you are looking at AWS is, as a pen tester or even somebody who's trying to defend, is like you really want to keep in mind that anything that an IT person or a developer can do in the console, a bad guy can do via the API. Okay. As you're using AWS, just think about how it could be used, for bad. And I'll show you at least a couple of examples of that today. Next up, let's talk about API keys. So the way you authenticate against AWS, you've got usernames and passwords, and hopefully you've got multi-factor authentication. So when you're in the web user interface, that's how you authenticate. With the API, you're just using API keys. That's all you're using for authentication for the most part. There's a couple examples that are different, but this is what an API key looks like. It has a key ID and a secret access key. The secret access key is used to sign requests to the API, and that's how it knows that you are who you say you are. Where do you find API keys? You find them in code or in file systems or environmental variables. So oftentimes, rather than saving them on disk, they're loaded into memory directly via environment variables. That's an easy way to make it sort of scalable. Most common location is going to be in the .aws folder in a file called credentials. They're going to be in a profile. The default profile is called default, and that's the first profile that sort of gets created. And it has a key ID and an access key. There may be multiple sets of keys in this file that could be, for production and dev and test, blah, 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 or even, personal environments. So, this can be a really good source. And you may see, multiple keys in code, or you may see, one set in environment variables or multiple sets. There's other files in the AWS directory that are sort of interesting. You can kind of know which region they probably use most if they've got that configured. So that's a good region to start looking in, because a lot of AWS stuff is geolocated around the globe. Another location is the metadata service. So every EC2 instance, even containers, have this metadata interface. So I believe on containers is a different IP. And there's all kinds of metadata in here. One example, this is just one I pulled off the web. This isn't even mine, and I'm sure it's been rotated, since 2018. But this is the type of response you get back, and this is, an API key that I'm sure has since been rotated. And basically, this is a short-lived API key, so it expires at a certain point. But if you're talking to a live instance, you can use this API key to authenticate as that machine against AWS and do stuff with it. And if they've delegated that machine roles and privileges within AWS, you may be able to sort of privilege escalate that way. So if you can curl this IP address or socks into it or shell into it, or a web shell that can curl this stuff, like any way you can get at this information, is maybe a good way to sort of prove impact. All right, next up, searching for API keys. So these are like some good grep patterns that you can search for. So things like key ID and secret, and AKIA is the beginning of all long-lived access keys. It's actually a list of prefixes that Amazon uses to delegate different privileges or different keys. Definitely a potential area for you to alert on. So if you're tailing your search logs and you find people searching for this type of stuff, maybe a good thing to alert on. Another good place to search is CloudFormation. This is the configuration script language native to AWS. Not super used outside of AWS and vendor implementations, but it's out there. And even if you don't get access to credentials this way, you may get access to some other information. The other thing is Terraform, which you're probably going to see much more commonly. And this is an example. If you're interested at all in cloud, you may want to learn about Terraform. It's a very powerful automation language for, just if you want to spin up 20 virtual machines in EC2 in a minute, you can do it with Terraform. It really is very cool. This is an example of a piece of metadata called user data, which is basically like a virtual machine's startup script. And this is an example of a bash script that's embedded in this Terraform script. So user data is really useful because it's highly variable and it's set by the user. It's the most wide ranging of the metadata that the user can set. And so there could be nothing in there, and there may also be like the keys to the kingdom. And we'll come back to that as an example later. So I wrote an AWS attack framework. It's basically a bunch of scripts that use Boto 3, which is the Python AWS SDK. I named the project Redboto. I named it something else, but I had to rename it. And I think it's up to 9 scripts maybe and growing at this point. And if you want to bang on them, feel free. I'll show you a couple examples that I use all the time and I find really super useful. The first example is this thing called check AWS key. The first thing when you get your hands on some API keys, it's like, I don't even know if these things are valid, right? Like, are they valid, or like were they rotated 6 months ago, or like they just didn't clean them up? Like, what is the deal with these keys, right? And so this script will do some really basic light checks against some things in IAM to see if the keys are even valid. They appear to be valid. What groups do the keys have access to? If they're not in any groups, there's probably a fairly low permissions. If they have read access, if they're in a read group, it's like, well, they're probably just read. If they're in, admin group, that's like, you probably hit some jackpot there. Another way to really prove impact is like, does the user have an MFA enabled that's associated with the keys, if there is one, which may just be a value add, to be like, hey, maybe you should have MFA enabled on this account as well. And so that's what check AWS key does. It's basically just your very basic proving impact, like, yes, I got keys and they are valid. Here you go, people I'm doing the test for. Next up is a really good like audit script, and basically it's called describe trail status. And what this does is it goes through each region that AWS has and basically says, hey, do you have CloudTrail, which is the logging system built into AWS? Do you have it enabled? Because a lot of people say, oh, I only do AWS stuff in these 2 regions, and so I only have CloudTrail enabled in those regions, and I only care about them, those 2 regions. And like, if somebody spins up a bunch of Bitcoin miners in EU West 1 and you don't have logging enabled there, that's going to be a problem for you at some point. This is just a good test to check to make sure that you have CloudTrail enabled everywhere. Next up, we're going to talk about user data. So I talked about it a little bit earlier, but basically it is the machine's, an EC2 instances startup script. So this is the virtual machine startup script, basically. And it's Bash for Linux and PowerShell for Windows. Essentially, it's just base64 and stored as metadata in AWS. Okay. And there's lots of metadata you can pull down. This one is some time to give you some quick wins. So this script, describe user data, iterates through all of the different regions and basically dumps user data from any instances that have it. So anything that's not empty, it will dump the script. So in this case, they have a bash script that has yet more API keys in here that may help you, privilege escalate or whatever. All right, next up, this one's a cool one. S3 is, storage technology. So this is an example of an S3 bucket that just has some files in it. It might even be used for like a static website. And, basically it looks like there's just like some, an index page and some JavaScript and some images and CSS. It's what it looks like is just in this S3 bucket. Okay. But this bucket has versioning enabled, which means that it stores a copy of every file that has been created. It also holds on to files that are deleted, okay, which is interesting. And there you can, in the GUI, you can tell it has versioning enabled because it has like this version slider, which shows you, each file and its various versions. But what I did when I found out about this cool feature is I was like, well, like deleted files are usually like, can be kind of interesting. So I was like, show me the deleted files on this bucket is what I want to know. So I wrote this script, describe deleted items. And basically how it works is it shows you all the names of the files that have been deleted, their version IDs, and then when they were last modified, or when they were deleted is usually what this means. And the reason the version ID is important is because there might be several copies of this file that have been deleted over the months or years this bucket has existed. And you can reference each one of them when you download them. So you can say, I want this version, and you specify this version ID, and it downloads this deleted item from the bucket. So you're downloading some deleted credentials that were in the bucket at one point, and you can now get access to those potentially if you have the right access, of course. And then the script just tells you how to actually get the file with the AWS CLI. So that's S3 versioning. Lots of cool things you can do with S3 versioning, actually, that I'm still working on and thinking about. EC2 Linux hosts are all SSH authentication. So if you've gotten access to some API keys, you probably have gotten access to a device or a machine or like a developer's workstation or an IT person's workstation, where you were able to find some like key pairs. And they always end in .pen because that's how AWS names them. They're often called like key pair, or like, they have something meaningful in the name that tells you what it does. So it might be like production key pair or something like that. So the usernames are usually either like Ubuntu or root or EC2 user, something like that. And there's all kinds of stuff that you can do once you have a shell in the box, if you have SSH access, of course. Like if they have an ACL'd off SSH access from where you're at on the internet. One quick one-liner that you can use to get all of the instances and their platform, like, is it a Linux box or is it a Windows box? This is a command that can quickly sort of tell you that. I think Windows, it tells you if it's Windows. If it's Linux, it's usually blank, or FreeBSD, I'm sure would be blank. So, and it'll tell you the public IP address and the instance ID associated with that. Let's talk about Windows passwords. Okay, so the AWS people kind of had a problem on their hands because they were like, with Linux hosts, I've got good, strong public key, encryption that I can rely on for authentication. What do we do for Windows hosts? And they set up a system that is, as good as you can do with Windows. Because Windows, you can't use private keys to authenticate to a Windows host. You still have to rely on passwords. And so what AWS does is they encrypt the passwords within AWS and then make you present an associated private key to decrypt that password and then give you the plain text password. Okay. So when you create a Windows machine, you get this window, it says get password. You say, okay, give me the private key associated with the machine, and it decrypts and gives you the password. So how this works, right? If you think about it, it's like you've got your authentication in the console, you've got your authentication that is username and password, plus hopefully multi-factor authentication. That authenticates you to the console. And then the password is encrypted using the public key of this private key. And so you present the private key to the AWS console, it decrypts it there in the browser, and it dumps out a Windows password. Okay, that gives you the credential. Okay. And remember, this is a great example. When I told you earlier, everything that you could do in the console, you can also do via the API. All right, so with the API, again, all you need are API keys and that pen, and you authenticate with the API keys, you decrypt with the private key, you get a Windows password. Okay, so I wrote a script to handle this called getEC2WinCreds.py. Basically, you give it a region and a key file, and it attempts to decrypt on each of the Windows hosts within that environment. Okay, now, this is an example of an instance. The name, internal IP address, public IP address, and the associated password that comes out of it. Good thing about AWS is they use nice, strong, long passwords. It's unfortunate if you're able to dump them using this method. Okay. Something to keep in mind, obviously, you need to be able to have RDP or some other access to this box. So if they've ACL'd it off, you may be out of luck, you may need to find another way in. And this is just the initial password of the box. So if they have rotated or disabled the original administrator user, you are kind of out of luck. But it's just an interesting way to sort of show prove impact. I was this close. This is my favorite example. Okay, so like I was looking at this and I was like, okay, so you've got an instance, which is a virtual machine, and it's got various volumes. It may have like a C drive and a D drive or whatever, or maybe it just has a C drive that has a volume. And I was like, how could I get the files off of the volume without connecting over SSH or RDP to the instance? How could I just use the Amazon API to download files from like the C drive of a domain controller, for example, hypothetically? So what I did is I wrote a script that automates that process using only the AWS API, because one of the cool things is this is virtualization. So even if the instance is running, you can take a snapshot of the target volume, spin up an attacker instance, connect that instance to the snapshot volume that you want to copy the files off of. Then you spin up an S3 bucket, encrypt the files, load them onto S3, download them and decrypt them back to your hacker laptop. And so I have a script that, as long as you have enough permissions in the environment, and you do need a lot of permissions in the environment to pull this off, but if you've got admin access in the environment, this is something that you can demonstrate doing. And basically, the main thing that you need is you need a volume ID from which to steal stuff from, and you need to know what files you want to download. Describe instances is something you can run with the AWS command line interface. It's kind of ugly and it's unwieldy, I think. So I wrote a wrapper script that's a little bit easier to use. And basically, you just tell it what region you want to see, and it will dump various attributes depending on your command line switches. So in this example, we have the instance ID of a DC1. It doesn't matter if it's running or stopped. And then this is the volume that we want to copy off of. And we're going to copy the ntds.dit SAM system security off of this thing. We have a pretty good feeling that this is the C drive because it's like SDA1 in AWS. So let's see a video of how that works. And it's going to go quickly. But basically, you've got a list of files you want to download, your SAM system security and ntds.dit. You've got so this is where we find the name of the volume that we want to download. So it's this one. We run get ec2 files.py, volume, region, the list of files. It spins up an S3 bucket in the environment, sets permissions, takes a snapshot of the volume that we want to dump off of, creates an instance that hooks up to that snapshot. That takes about 5 or 10 minutes. And then it downloads those files from S3 as they're uploaded. Then it cleans all of that stuff up. And we're left with, in our directory, ntds.dit, SAM system security. They're all encrypted on the way up and down. So as secure as I can make it. Yeah, so that's a way to steal off of a host using just the API. It's kind of a cool demo, I think. So let's talk about some things to do to defend. And I like to use this brain explosion meme to sort of explain the various levels of brain nirvana that you could achieve with AWS networking. I think AWS networking is super complicated, but it's also like you got to put some effort into it as well. So like the first step that you usually do when you're in an AWS environment, you got management interfaces on public internet. This is SSH, RDP. That's the very base, not great situation. Get more human brain. You want to start limiting your network changes via IAM. And this one's a little counterintuitive. It's like, okay, well, why am I doing this? Well, you're doing this because only the network team should be able to do this type of change. You should not have IT people or like regular IT people or developers changing network stuff in production environment. And then next step is you want to start ACL restrictions, security groups, getting a little bit more scalable. And then the next thing is, like VPN tunnels to AWS so that you can only access your AWS cloud networks via, VPN tunnels that you've got established or are well monitored and looked at. The last step is monitor network traffic changes and traffic. Some of the best things that you can do is, you've got a good configuration. You're also monitoring traffic changes and logging things as well. So definitely, log your regions that you don't use, even if you don't use them, because you want to be able to go back and see what happened in those regions after something happens. Most people have log validation on these days. Are there weird things happening in different regions? Are machines restarting that shouldn't? That's something you should be able to catch. That's like a baseline. Same thing I said about networking. I'm going to say about IAM. It's really important to have somebody who actually understands IAM doing what they're doing. If you have somebody who's doing your identity access management stuff off the side of their desk, that is going to be you're gonna have problems eventually. I promise you. So get to a place where you're really doing least privilege within IAM. You're potentially using a SAML with MFA. AWS supports all kinds of different SAML, and then try to lock down your API keys by IP, and actually test to make sure that your keys are actually rotatable. Because if you have a compromised key and you're like, well, but I don't know if I can rotate this. You're in the same situation that people were 10 or 15 years ago with domain admins, where it's like, well, everything runs that, account. And so you're afraid to change the password. So other tools to take a look at, Scout 2, really good auditing tool. It's sort of like the Nessus of AWS. Gives you a lot of really pretty reports that you can hand off to people within your organization or elsewhere. It gives you, what's going well, what is going well, what to fix, and what maybe not to fix. It gives you reports like this. So, how many users are without MFA? That's an important thing for you to know. That's made by NCC Group. Cartography, kind of like the AWS Bloodhound, and it is made by the people at Lyft. They add more features to it all the time. You can do queries in it to be like, show me all the S3 buckets that have public access in my environment. So it can do all kinds of things. It's a very good tool and gives you these nice little pictures that float all over the place. Next up, you got some CTFs that are very valuable, and Prowler is an excellent tool for checking CIS benchmarks and best practices. Really, if you're running nothing else in your AWS environment, run Prowler. Really great tool. Prowler is made by Tony Blix. So is this repository of AWS security tools. All kinds of stuff in here. Good and bad tools are in here. If you're looking to get into this area, take a look at these at this list. Other than that, that's it for me. My name is Jim Shaver. Feel free to DM me on Twitter at Elitist. And Redboto is the name of the project there where all my AWS scripts are.
Jim, the scripts you wrote look amazing. I'm definitely going to check them out. They look super useful.
Yeah, well, thank you. I really appreciate the opportunity for and everybody who came out today. And thanks to all the sponsors, and thanks to all the people who made this come together. Because I know it takes an army or a village